Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. As much as I'd like to be putting out a brand new interview every week, life does not always permit that. And on some of those occasions, I like to put out a highlights episode where I share some excerpts from old episodes, some of my favorite moments from the past. In this case, 3 episodes from 2019. And this is from before the era when this podcast had video, which will explain why. If you're watching this on YouTube, there is no video, just audio for this episode. So to give an overview of what you'll be hearing, some bits from my conversation with the pianist and composer Mark Christopher Brandt about music, particularly musical improvisation, and how it relates to the spiritual life. You'll be hearing a bit of my conversation with Father Aquinas Guilbeau, Dominican priest, on the nature of the common good and authority, and a bit from my first interview that I ever did with James Matthew Wilson, where he reads a poem that he wrote about the great Jesuit explorer of America, Father Marquette. So to start off, Mark Christopher Brandt, my favorite guest. All of the 4 interviews that I've done with him are very well worth listening to. And by the way, I'll link to all of the full episodes that I'm excerpting from in this episode in the show notes for this. And this episode, you'll be hearing clips from a long episode I did with him, episode 33, Structure and Freedom in Music and in Christ. Since I'm going to be playing you a bunch of clips from that episode, I won't play them all back to back. I'm going to scatter them, intersperse them with some of the clips from the other episodes. But to start off, you'll hear him talking about why, historically speaking, improvisation and the ability to improvise has been considered the mark of a true musician, why one of his major goals in his musical life from the beginning has been to develop the ability to improvise pieces totally from scratch, and how his conversion actually helped him to achieve that goal, and talking about the relationship between structure and freedom in music and the spiritual life. Here's the first clip.
You know, we all know that Bach was improvising, and all of the great classical musicians were improvising. This only stopped, in the last couple, 100 years, that classical musicians don't improvise anymore, although they're starting to get back into it because of jazz. Yeah. But improvisation is the mark of a musician. That's the defining factor of a musician. So anybody who knows music from the ancient times, it's just something that comes with recognizing who a musician is and who a musician isn't. You could have somebody who plays well and has great skill, but if they don't improvise, they're not considered a musician. And that might anger people now, but that was how it was in Bach's time. If you could improvise, you were recognized as a musician. If you had the skill and ability to play well, then you might be a musician, but you could also improvise and make things up as you needed to for any given situation. When that died out, it started coming into jazz, and then everybody thought jazz musicians were amazing because they were improvising. But it's the mark of an artist in the music world is one who improvises. It's the same with prayer. You can say all kinds of formal prayers, but that doesn't mean you love Jesus. That doesn't make you a Christian. It's the lifestyle and the relationship you have with the Lord directly, being able to talk to him off the cuff, being open to the Holy Spirit, and being, in each moment alive with each situation, and being flexible and not rigid or bound by your own parameters. This is the mark of a Christian, is that freedom to love in all situations. And that's what we're striving for as Christians, and that's what musicians used to be striving for, was that ultimate freedom, to be able to let go of control and just let music pour out of them. Then you stop, you document the ideas you like, and now you're a composer. And it's that simple.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
But it's a lot more complicated to get there, of course, as a practicing artist. But that's really it for higher art. That's the simplicity of it explained, I think.
Did you always have the aspiration to create projects where you improvise completely from scratch, as opposed to the way that a jazz musician normally would, based on a set of chord changes?
That's been the goal all my life. The goal for me was to do what that kid was doing in high school. After I saw him, that was the goal. I wanted to be able to sit down at the piano and play and have music to play that was in me or coming from me, and not need music or not have to have a prepared piece. So that is exactly what I've been working at my entire life, was how to do that and trying to get to that. So everything I've done artistically has led to that goal or has been on that path. That's what I've always wanted to do. So jazz standards or things like Duke Ellington, or, you can name anyone, any song that you would use as a vehicle to improvise, I've always seen as training for being able to play without any music or without a vehicle, and to just be able to sit down and play what you hear, and to actually be able to hear something inside you and have it come out. That's what I've been working towards my entire life.
So what does that take? I mean, there's the discipline of music, and then there's something a little bit more spiritual that's required.
Well, I think it takes being a Catholic to be. That's what did it for me. I didn't. None of that. I didn't get that connection until I had my conversion, and where I really decided to pursue Catholicism as a way of life. And as I began to do that, and then suddenly I started to realize where the music I was looking for would be coming from. So that affected me and how I was, and then I knew what I was going for. I was trying to discover God. And so in the music, that's where I found God. I always look back and know now in hindsight that he was always there, reaching out to me and guiding me and propelling me in a certain direction, moving me in the music. But I knew definitively then, yes, this was God pursuing me and guiding me and wanting me to be with him and join him in that divine life. So that then I began to see the parallels between musicianship and Catholicism, or spiritual life, which for me is, specifically Catholicism. Because I did experiment with other forms and other religions, but it was always just an experiment trying to find a way to have peace in a chaotic world. But, and that's a whole other, separate discussion. But in terms of music, the parallels are just striking, and they're rather obvious to me anyway, that
right.
You practice, so you practice your religion just like you practice music. And the goal is to go out the door and not need a prayer book to consult before you have a conversation with someone, and not need a manual. You shouldn't have to open up the catechism to read what you're going to talk about or how you're going to talk to a person. You enter into dialogue with people, and you should be in love with them, and you should be working to find common ground, find ways to correct them if they're in error, or love them patiently. If you discern you shouldn't correct them, all of this stuff is happening in the millisecond with your attentiveness to the Holy Spirit in you. This is exactly what's happening to a pianist or any musician who's improvising. They have that intense listening to what's happening within them that almost is not really listening. It's outflowing and just being one with it. But it comes from the training and the practice of listening in daily, time at the instrument. Just like the more time you spend in prayer, the more intensely, closely united to the Holy Spirit you will be.
It sounds like, you're giving us an idea already of the intense demands of obviously of Catholicism, but also of music and improvising, in that if you're going to be able to respond in the millisecond, as you put it, then not only do you have to be sort of have your heart in the right place in that millisecond and be attentive, as you said, but you have to be prepared. You have to have downloaded those things already into yourself. And not only do you have to have understanding of the truth internalized, but you also have to have self-discipline. You have to have discipline over your body and your mind, just as you would have to as a musician. So it really there's no let up, and there has to be. It really is a constant quest.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what comes to mind is the amount of musicians I've been with in my life who are really good at what they do and really gifted improvisers, but in many moments they get scared and panic, or they judge themselves and judge their playing and make decisions in the moment that have them falling back to things of safety that they've trained into themselves or their hands and arms, rather than go forward in that risk because they're not giving in to the fear. And that is very demanding. And that is exactly what I've been working to preach, is that the more that you attempt to have freedom, the more you realize how hung up you are. And
right.
the more that you want to be free from your patterns and your behaviors and your pathology, the more you realize that you're not going to be able to get there without Jesus, without that grace, and without that indwelling, without the flow. You have to cooperate with it, and you have to not give in to those judgments of yourself. And those are the same things that everybody's doing in daily life. So it is very demanding. You won't say hi to someone because you're afraid they'll think you're being too forward, or they'll think you're stupid, or you look like an idiot, or you're not dressed nice today, so you better not go over that way. All of these fast little things saying, don't move, don't go anywhere, don't do this, they're all preventing you from being loving and being there, out there, and smiling and saying, how are you today? And that's it. That's how God enters the world through us. And we're so caught up with our own personal judgments of ourselves that we won't even say hi to somebody who's a stranger. And that is exactly what happens to improvisers. You're playing and you're thinking all these thoughts in your mind about how you're playing, and is it good? Is it bad? Am I doing the right? And you just can't play with freedom with all of that going on. You're driven by your own judgments and what you have found and discovered works, and what sounds safe, what people will like. So you start playing towards the listening audience on the whole. And then you're bound again, like all the musicians before you who, catered to the human respect or the need for applause. And again, that is exactly what I've been trying to avoid. So it's not anarchy or chaos, because that's not who the Holy Spirit is. But if you're truly united in prayer and interested in the music as it's coming, then you end up with something that is even beyond yourself. And you're not playing so that people will like it or be impressed. You're completely focused on what's coming out in the moment, and that's all that matters.
In this next clip, Mark talks about the struggle of artists to fully embrace their vocation and be at peace with the gifts given to them by God, and some problems that can arise in the pop culture where the incentives are often to sell one's gifts short and not attain one's full potential in order to instead reach a mass audience.
The way I was told when I was young was that you can't serve God and be a musician and an artist because it's countercultural. It's not respectable. You're not going to be working at life. You're basically a bum and you're just floating. So these unfortunate negative things, but those would turn someone away from pursuing music typically and make them give up and go into something else. But a person who's created to be an artist doesn't do that because they can't. It's impossible to not be what you are. And so you can just be bad at it. And so that I was just unhappy. I was into the counterculture. I was into all kinds of problematic things. But I never for a minute thought I wasn't a musician. I just figured that God didn't love me because I was one, and I would never be able to make him happy. But I couldn't stop being an artist. So the rebellion and the drugs and the alcohol and all these things that get pegged with artists are actually not because they're artists, and it's not always what they want to be doing. It's that is how they're coping with the fact that they don't feel as though they belong here. That, they can't deal with what they've been given. So that's really the revelation, is that God loves me. He loved me and he made me to be this person, this artist. So when I discovered that, that was almost immediately freeing and brought me into the music at a deeper level, because I suddenly realized, well, he's not mad at me because I'm pursuing this. He is actually the one giving it to me. And so he wouldn't be mad at me for what he's giving me. And this is, this, as a teacher, this is why I always refer some students to not be musicians. I'll tell, no, you should do this and that with your talent, but don't go into music, because I can recognize that some are actually artists and they're not going to be happy any other way. But many are just really gifted musicians, play this piano well, play the instruments well, but they should go into other things. There's other jobs, do something else, and then you'll find why God made you. And then some people are meant to be musicians, and that, that covers a lot of problems in society. If more people went where they belonged and not into music because it's fun or cool, then the field of artists would be more limited. The field of musical output would be less, and it would be done by people who were put here to do it, not just a bunch of people who have some talent and can make nice songs. That's a very big door to a large conversation, but it's something I've been studying all my life. And it's, why, the pop culture is problematic, because many of the people in the pop culture are those who didn't have the courage to pursue the deeper gifts God gave them, or to pursue God himself. That their talent is undeniable, but it's not even close to what they should be using it for. And so it goes bad on them. And then there's as many who are really skilled at craft and math and music, and so they can have a couple of songs that everybody likes, and they're good at business, but everybody wants people to clap for them, so they end up excelling at having, the fan base and the entertainment situation. And that, again, it detracts from the true beauty that God is trying to offer the world, and it becomes eclipsed by, things that are flashy and glittery. So it's not sour grapes for me, because I've had a very great life and a successful career serving God with my art. So I don't find any reason to complain about this. It's just an observation. And I would say the same thing about priests. I've learned that about priests. Like, who has more dignity than a priest? This is an incredible, imagine trying to live up to that one. And I've thought a lot about that with priests, and the ones I know who are just amazing human beings, amazing men, and great role models. And I'm so glad to know them and to be able to walk around and just be who they are with the awareness of the incredible dignity that they've been given by God. That would make somebody like me really nervous. And so I had that same struggle, to a much lesser degree, coming to terms with the fact that I was a musician.
Listeners, let me take a moment to tell you about Catholic Culture's 2022 fall campaign. As you may know, the Catholic Culture podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org, which has been one of the most reliable, independently run Catholic apostolates online since it started in 2003. And these days we're entirely funded by donations, so naturally the fall campaign is a very crucial time for us to muster the support we need to continue our work. So this year I'm happy to say that we are announcing our largest fall challenge campaign ever. A group of key donors is offering a generous $111,000 to match every gift that's made between October 20th and December 8th, the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception. But in order to win the challenge, we have to raise the total amount by the deadline, or else we'll lose that matching grant. Catholic Culture has a lot more than just podcasts going on. It has daily Catholic news and commentary, a rich array of resources for living the liturgical year, and a vast library of Catholic documents. And this material reaches not just people in the US or the Anglosphere, but millions around the world. We often hear from priests in places like India and Africa who say that they use our materials in preparing their catechesis or their preaching. And again, all this work depends on our users and our listeners, so please do consider giving. Even a little bit counts, especially since until December 8th, your contribution will be doubled. To donate, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio or just click the link in the description. But if this isn't the right time for you to donate monetarily, then we ask that you pray for us, just as we pray for all our listeners, viewers, readers, and benefactors daily. Thank you, and God bless you. Okay, so we'll be coming back to Mark, and I'll even play you some of his music, but first we are going to go to a substantial excerpt from episode 56, Vindicating Authority with Father Aquinas Guilbeau. And this was an episode where we discussed the thought of the philosopher Yves Simon regarding authority and the common good. And in this clip, he talks about the thought of Charles de Koninck and Yves Simon on what the common good is. We also talk a little bit about issues of authority and knowledge and some modern kind of rationalistic errors in regard to authority.
So someone I focused my own research on is Charles de Koninck, who is, like Simon, a Francophone European philosopher living in North America, during the Second World War. De Koninck, though, immigrated much earlier and spent his whole teaching career in Quebec. But he wrote a tremendous little essay in 1943 called The Primacy of the Common Good. And what he does in that little work is provide perhaps the best, certainly best contemporary commentary on St. Thomas's doctrine of the common good that we have. And so I wrote my own dissertation as a kind of commentary on de Konink's commentary of Aquinas. And what de Koninck does in that short work is model for us, the kind of conversation we need to have in order to use the term common good wisely and accurately. So there are a couple steps that he shows. First, in trying to identify what the common good is, we really need to understand what the common good is in distinction from the particular good. So insofar as, we all desire the good, insofar as we desire our own perfection, certain goods that we find in nature that promote our own flourishing, a lot of those goods are what we call particular goods, that they're goods that we acquire, we consume, they keep us alive, they promote our general well-being. But in using those goods, they benefit only me, So, my hamburger is my hamburger, my sweater is my sweater, my office is my office. Insofar as those things are goods for me, they're not goods for someone else. In order for me to benefit from their good, I have to consume that good in such a way that someone else, can't. And that's not an injustice. That's just the nature of the good itself. Two people can't occupy the same sweater at one time. Two people can't eat the same banana at the same time. It's just the nature of those goods to be particular, to extend their goodness to one beneficiary, to one person. So a good that's particular to one person is therefore alien, to another. Those aren't the only kinds of goods, though, that exist in the world. Those aren't the only kinds of goods that contribute to our goodness and well-being. There's also what we call common goods. And this is, in distinction from a particular good, a good that is itself singular, it's one, but it can be the good of many people at one time. And there's a way in which we call those goods, common goods. Now, already, though, we need to make another distinction, because there's some goods that we call common, which are nothing more than really a collection of particular goods. And there are other goods that we call common that are really common in themselves, which is to say they can be enjoyed by many at one time without themselves being divided. Let me give some examples of that. So, for example, let's say, it's your birthday and your family provides you a big chocolate cake. There's a way in which that chocolate cake is a common good of the whole party. But what kind of good is that? Is that a good that we just call common because many people share in it, or is it really common in itself? I would say it's the former, because how is it that the party then enjoys the chocolate cake? It's not the chocolate cake as a whole. Somebody has to take a knife and start cutting the thing up into individual pieces. So in order for that common good of the cake to be enjoyed, it has to be divided, and has to be divided in such a way that the whole no longer exists. Everybody gets just a piece of the cake, and it's the piece of the cake that they enjoy and that benefits them. So there's a sort of way in which, even though we call the cake a common good, it's really, at least potentially, nothing more than a collection of particular goods. It only can benefit people when it's cut up, divided, and everybody gets a little piece or part of the good. You can look at a pension fund in the same way. You can look at a city's water reservoir in the same way. We can look at those as common goods because they benefit many people. But how do they benefit people? Well, by being cut up and divided. And the whole disappears as it disintegrates into its individual parts, which are then enjoyed by many people.
He contrasts a business partnership of a certain kind where the two are going their separate ways with the goods they have each attained from it, with a contract of another kind like marriage.
Exactly. And then so at marriage, and that's what I was about to get to, is just in contrasting that kind of common good with what you might call an authentic common good. These are goods that, again, are singular, they're numerically one, but they benefit many people at once without itself being divided. And these are rather remarkable because they're transcendent, we say. These goods have the ability of sharing their goodness with many people at once, again, without being divided. The whole remains a whole, the good remains whole, and it encompasses, it benefits many people at one time. And what are these? Well, these are social goods. So the good of the family, the good of the city, the good of the church, the good of beatitude, the good of heaven. These are all social goods in which the good of the whole is the good of all of its parts, all at once, without the whole being divided. In fact, the parts contribute to, they make up, integral parts of the whole and enjoy the good of the whole as such. So, for example, just think about your family. The family is made up of many members. It has its good. There's the good of the Smiths, which is also all at once the good of Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smiths, and all of the little Smiths that they have. You can't say that, there's just kind of one part of the good of the Smith family that belongs to the father, one part of the good of the Smith family that belongs to the mother, another part that belongs to the children. Each and every part of the whole, each and every part of the family enjoys the whole good insofar as they're a part of the whole. And so when you start to look at the metaphysics of these goods, you realize how remarkable they are, that within nature, we have these goods that transcend individuality, that encompasses many individuals at once without themselves being divided. When you compare that to a particular good or just a collection of particular goods, you really see how unique and how special, how noble these real common goods are. The good of the family, the good of the city, the good of the church, the good of the universe, the good of beatitude, the good of heaven. So it kind of helps us, to make a lot of these important distinctions in order to identify precisely what we're talking about when we say that the common good takes a certain priority over the particular good, how our pursuit of the particular good should be oriented to our enjoyment of the common good. That's just to say that, I, as a member of my family, I, as a citizen of my city, and as I pursue all of the goods that keep me alive and promote my individual well-being, I do that. I pursue those goods. I enjoy those goods within the context of also pursuing the good of my family and also pursuing the good of my political community. The moment I turn away from the family or turn away from the city to pursue my own particular good is not only a manifestation of a kind of selfishness, but it betrays our social and political nature, and it deprives us of, in fact, the goods that are greater than our own particular goods, which are these social goods, the good of the family and the good of the city.
Yves Simon also talks about this in terms of the perfection of human nature, and I'd like to read a quote from him, which I really liked. He says, "The masterpiece of the natural world cannot be found in the transient individual, nor can it be found in the species, which is not imperishable except in the state of universality, but in that state it is no longer unequivocally real. Human communities are the highest attainments of nature, for they are virtually unlimited with regard to diversity of perfections and virtually immortal."
Right.
So there's that point about the diversity of perfections. It's very interesting. And it especially in a time of, extreme specialization, that really hits home.
No, and it's what he's talking about there is just what the ancients and the medievals would have seen in comparing, let's say, the common good to our particular goods. I mean, that there's certain things that we enjoy within the family that we could never produce on our own, which is to say, the good of, as Aquinas would say, the good of the hearth, the good of the common table, that life within the family is shared in such a way that I share life with others and that I enjoy goods with others that just wouldn't benefit me in the same way if I enjoyed them simply by myself. So not only does the family give me the opportunity to enjoy certain goods that I could never attain on my own, but even those goods that I could attain on my own, the way I enjoy them in the family with others kind of redounds to my well-being, in a way that I wouldn't enjoy if I was just enjoying those goods alone. For Aquinas, this was quite natural. This was a manifestation, expression of our social and political nature. So that gets to Simone's point there, that there's a diversity of perfections that the family offers that our own particular goods don't. And you can extend that up to the common good of the city, that there are certain goods that the city affords us that are the result of our living together as citizens within a political community that even the family, is incapable of providing itself. So there's a certain way in which the common good of the family is oriented to the higher common good of the city, that families, in a sense, live together within the political community to enjoy the goods and protections that only a political community can provide. So there's a diversity of perfection in the family and even greater diversity of perfection in the city. And these are our better goods. These are better than our particular goods. We enjoy our particular goods in these higher goods. And again, it's a testimony to ancient medieval philosophy in recognizing this, that we're just kind of humble enough to sit back and look at reality and marvel at these social goods that emerge, which the modern turn to the individual and the growth of individualism has somewhat blinded us to.
We're kind of talking about it on an ontological level, I suppose, but Yves Simon, one of the things that he talks about is the necessity of having unity of common action. So once you've established there's such a thing as a common good, obviously action needs to be coordinated in various ways.
Right.
But why would it need to be done so by an authority? Because, of course, it's important to emphasize that he wants to know whether in a society, perhaps a small one, composed completely of virtuous and intelligent individuals, there would be any necessity for authority, in the sense that if it's possible to determine the best common action by reason alone, then a society of intelligent and virtuous individuals could, seemingly come to that spontaneously. And that is true, but he wants to emphasize that there are questions in which there is no abstractly determinable best answer.
Right. I mean, he makes a beautiful point there, because he really knocks, the Enlightenment down a notch or two, which is to say, he takes kind of the overconfidence that we have in reason, which is to say, not really an overconfidence in reason, but a certain conception of reason, that if reason operates rightly, it only is going to arrive at kind of a singular truth. So that if you have three people who have optimal functioning reason according to the ideals of the Enlightenment, they're all going to come to the same conclusion about things in any kind of realm of thinking, because that's just kind of how they prejudge what reason can do. Simone says, no, that's actually not the case, that the increase of knowledge and kind of the higher functionings of our reason contribute to not just kind of one understanding of things, but rather a way of seeing things in all of their complexity, in all of their richness. So which is to say that, a society of persons who come together to achieve a goal, the increase in the knowledge of their goal doesn't mean that they're all going to spontaneously conclude that there's only one real rational way to get to the end.
Under concrete
those
contingent circumstances.
Yeah, in their own day, in their own time, in their own place, that they're all going to come to the same conclusion about that. No, I mean, Simone says no. I mean, the more you know about the end, or the more society comes to appreciate its end, the more that the society is going to recognize that there is a whole variety of ways to achieve their goal. There are a whole variety of ways in which they can come together and work together to achieve the goal. And therefore, yeah, you're not going to get kind of common united action to arise spontaneously. You're going to just get a whole bunch of people who see that there are 10,000 ways to get to the end. And among good people and smart people, they might disagree as to what prudently is the best course of action. And that's where Simone says the need for authority arises out of an abundance of the good and an abundance of knowledge about the good. If a people or a society are going to come together and engage in common action to achieve the common end, there has to be one practical course that's set out for them, that among the many ways to achieve the end, one has to be settled upon and set as the course of action as the whole. And for Simone, that's the essential kind of work of authority. It's to coordinate common activity of a community towards its common end in the very concrete and material ways and means to achieve the end. So it's not really, authority doesn't set the end so much as it sets the means for a community for achieving the end.
Just to sort of restate what you've said there, the idea Simone is referring to is that essentially there is never a situation where there are several equally good options to choose between. That's simply an illusion of ignorance. And just as in the realm of science, sort of theoretical science, there's only ever one right answer, and any kind of indifference between multiple answers is a result of ignorance and kind of a partial measure. If you had enough scientific knowledge, at least in theory, one best way would always prevail. And there's a great line where he says, this belief expresses aversion to the mystery involved in free choice, as well as to the darkness of contingency. And one example he gives of an area where contingency is at play in the decisions of authority is the existence of borders of a city, of a state, of a country. And of course, those are not just due to the acts of authority, obviously, but it's a particularly relevant answer today because there's a sense, and again, I had this in my earlier days, that I thought, well, anything that is not sort of rationally determinable is arbitrary. And if it's arbitrary, then it's meaningless. So I kind of thought, and I think a lot of the sort of people who are in favor of the eradication of borders think this way, that it's essentially meaningless because it's contingent, because nobody can really ultimately give a complete rational explanation for why, these two communities are separate rather than part of one larger community.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's to show that even though that's steeped, like where borders lie, is steeped in contingency, it's our job to show that that's not arbitrary. For example, I'm in Washington, D.C. Right next to us is Arlington, Virginia. And there's a big old river that runs between the two, which serves as a kind of natural boundary between these two groupings of people, which is to say that, the common good of Washington, D.C. is not the common good of Arlington, Virginia. We have two different names for those things because they constitute two different political communities. Sometimes the persons might overlap. They live in Arlington, they work in D.C., and vice versa. But insofar as what the common good of Washington, D.C. is, that's not communicable to Arlington, Virginia. They have their own common good. And it makes sense that somewhere physically you would draw a line just in terms of where the extension of the authority of one political community would end and another would begin. Perhaps we do this more arbitrarily when there's no natural boundaries, like a river or a mountain range or something like that, right, or a lake between two communities. I'm thinking of Chicago and its surrounding suburbs where it's just, right, it's a street. On one side, you're in Chicago, on the other side, you're in, Aurora. And if those two touch, I don't know. My Illinois geography may be lacking here, but you know what I mean. it's a real reflection on the good here, and to recognize that the common good of the United States of America is not the common good of Mexico. Those are two distinct political communities, two distinct common goods there, and it may be conventional, but it's not arbitrary or meaningless that we would draw a border between those two as a way of regulating how life between those two political communities can be shared in some way.
And Simone wants to emphasize that even in cases where there is no easy thing you can point to, like a river making up the borderline, these things are based in, to some extent in the accident of history, but almost because of that, they're embedded in human identity and the richness of human life in a way that you can't simply sweep away with a perfectly rational administration. Okay, now for a little bit more of my interview with Mark Christopher Brandt. The impetus for that episode had been a series of projects that he had done where he improvised solo piano pieces from scratch. He did 3 such projects. So in this next bit, you'll hear him talk about the impetus for those projects and the very interesting way in which they were conceptualized and approached. And then you'll hear a piece from one of them. Maybe actually this would be a good point. Could you please explain the concept and how those first 2 albums were actually structured?
Well, the first one, 7 Moons, I had this idea that I was just going to go in and, play off the cuff. But I thought, how am I going to do this? How am I going to put myself in a completely pressure situation or a creative situation where I'm not in control? Because the biggest thing about improvisation in the jazz world is that you have people saying they're improvising, but they're actually playing things they've already played at some point on songs that they play all the time. So it's not really improvisation. It's using the skills of sentence structure and combining their words, if you will, being the notes and the scales. But it's terrain that you've covered. How do you go in with absolutely nothing and do that when you're sitting here thinking, I'm going to go in with nothing and not be prepared? So, a month before the recording, how do you not think of what you'll do when the moment comes to play? So I decided that, I would set up a situation where I wasn't in charge of the decision making. I went for the 24 keys, the majors and the minors. There's 12 of each. And I chopped up little pieces of paper with the key names on the paper. And then I thought, well, I'll put those in a bowl or whatever and stir them up. And then I'll have somebody pick one and then tell me what it is. And I have to make up a song in that key right now. And then I thought, well, I'll add to the thought process or the organizational process so that I can't ramble and I can't just figure things out as I go. I can't just get lost in it. I'm going to have to really work at creating a piece from start to finish. So we'll put a time limit on it. And I can't remember. I think the first album, there was a 5-minute stopwatch on me. We figured out that if the person was going to, who was in the room, in the booth with me, he would raise his hand, kind of make a little waving sign when it got to be about 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So I had about that much time to start thinking of the ending and craft an ending. And then the piece was over. And then that was it. And then we'd go to the next one. And I thought, well, let me up the ante and I'll record it. So I'll video it so that there's no way I can go back and edit the piece and make it sound good for an album if I make mistakes, and it will be on video. And no matter what, I'm going to release the video as a professional level work of art so that I have the absolute best objective view of my ability as an improviser and mistakes and all. So if it's really horrible, then obviously I would have said, okay, this isn't something I should release. But if it's, anything like it would be nice if it would work out, then I'll release it. And so that was how I came about the idea. I divided the keys up mathematically, several different ways. And what I came up with was 3 groups of 8 to get them all in. And so then song titles. The first one I thought of 7 Moons. And I just took the 7 moons of Saturn randomly and then named the 8th piece Saturn. It absolutely had no more meaning than that, except that I wrote an essay that's in the booklet where I, was thinking about a little Saturn model when I was a kid in high school. I won't go into that now, but that I thought, well,
Sure.
It goes back to me being a child and having this moment thinking about this model in the classroom. And so I thought, well, there's a concept that goes back to my childhood. I'm trying to be a child. I'm just going to call this 7 Moons and relate it to that. The essay is actually pretty cool, though. So if anybody buys the DVD or goes to my website, you can get you can actually see the essay there. So that's how I came up with the idea. That was so I had a guy pulling the things out of the mixing bowl. I had somebody, then he would tell me what key. Then I had somebody say begin. Then I would play, and then he would wave his hand, and then I would end it, and then we would go to the next one. So that's how the concept was born. It was truly a test for my ability. That's what the point was. As an artist, I wanted to throw myself into the pressure cooker and having the tape going. I will only say that, if I'd done it live, there are millions of ways to segue out of a problem with an audience watching, and they would never know that you made a mistake. I've done that because you have to. But you can't do that with a video because people can see on the video and they could rewind it. You can't do that on an album unless you edit those things out. And so that upped the ante for me in my concentration. And I also wanted to be able to say, I improvised. I did not have preparation. I didn't cheat. I didn't say I'm doing something I'm not. This is completely exactly what I say it is. And it's God causing it. And so somebody else might say, well, he's really gifted. He's talented. He clearly practiced. He probably has a million options, whatever. But, anybody who really knows about music and knows about improvisation and knows what they can do on their instrument as a virtuoso, you can't watch that and not see that this is something really coming from heaven. It's not possible to view it any other way. You can block that reality and say it's not that way, but that's all you're doing is blocking, because anybody who looks at that and thinks a human can actually sit down and do that off the cuff with no preparation, they don't know anything about music. It's not possible to do that without the Holy Spirit. It's absolutely impossible.
This is Come Creator Spirit from 7 Gifts. The next episode you're going to hear an excerpt from is episode 57, River of the Immaculate Conception. As I mentioned, this is my first interview with poet and philosopher James Matthew Wilson. The River of the Immaculate Conception was a poetry cycle commissioned to go along with the Mass of the Americas, composed by Frank LaRocca and commissioned by Archbishop Cordileone in San Francisco. And the cycle has to do with the history of Catholicism in the Americas. The River of the Immaculate Conception is the name that Father Marquette, the great explorer, gave to the Mississippi River. And in this clip, you will hear James explain the ballad form in poetry, which he uses in this poem, and then read this substantial poem that he wrote about Father Marquette's explorations. You mentioned ballad form, so could you talk about that a little bit? And feel free to read, we'll have you read the long one about Father Marquette, but maybe you could talk about the ballad form in general and read a few short passages from the other two if you want to illustrate, because those are the most, out of the three, those other two are actually the most song-like.
Yes, indeed. So the ballad form is the form of poetry that virtually everyone knows. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves. And, and pointed toward eternity, as I forget how the last line goes. But the 4-3 structure with just a rhyme at the end of every even line is one of our oldest poetic forms. Most of our popular songs, of course, have roughly 4 stresses. So 4-3 or 4-4. And by popular songs, I mean, chances are whatever you've listened to on the radio lately probably has that structure. And the ballad is, in the truest sense, a folk form. The ballad form is very old because it was a form that popular stories were often told in, including, you can even find ballads from the 18th century delivering the news about what was going on in America with the Revolutionary War to the streets of Ireland. The street ballads would recite those things. So the ballad form is the true traditional folk form, maybe one of the best known ballads in English is the old Sir Patrick Spens. I wanted to use the folk form because when I wrote about Juan Diego, because Juan Diego was himself a Aztec peasant. And further, I wrote the poem from the original Aztec language text, the earliest written account that we have of the revelation of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is often referred, and I'm forgetting how the Nahuatl language puts it, of course, but the first lines of it are, "Thus it is said." So, well, just to hear a sample of it, here's the first 2 stanzas of the hymn of Juan Diego. "Thus it is said that Juan Diego saw first the Aztec girl, her shoulders cloaked in starry mantle, her hair dark as the merle. The hill whereon she stood had been an ancient mother's home, laid low with all Tenochtitlan when stout Cortez had come." So that's a very simple form, seemed suitable to the subject, and I wanted to retell the subject in the same kind of simple language of that original Aztec text. In the other 2 saints' lives, I wanted them to be held together by the ballad form. I wanted them each to be in its own way a ballad. So, for instance, when I wrote the poem on Saint Elizabeth Seton, I took the original tetrameter kind of ballad and I just extended it so it became a 6-line ballad. At the time that Elizabeth Seton was young, in the hands of Wordsworth and Coleridge, the ballad was coming back into fashion, but was being developed as to be slightly more complex. There was just an added line or pair of lines from poem to poem that indicated, that made both you might say, a nod to the folk origins and simplicity of the ballad, but which also indicated a sort of greater sophistication or artistic technique. So a 6-line ballad stanza would have been a very common form in the late 18th and 19th century as ballads came back into fashion. So the Song of Elizabeth Seton is written in a ballad form. I'll just mention this briefly. It's also told the voice, the style of writing in the ballad I modeled on Jane Austen's novels, because to read Elizabeth Seton's letters, she seemed like a devout, spiritualized Jane Austen from her early youth in New York to the time of her conversion in Italy. So here's how the Song of Elizabeth Seton starts. Elizabeth was just a girl and watched as her young mother died. Her father, in his Yankee way, went out and fetched another bride, And so it was that all her life, loss and renewal were close allied. Years on, her William's father passed and left 5 children fatherless. She, who had young cares of her own, took them still in her tenderness, and she became a second mother to raise and love and school and dress. So it's a slightly more sophisticated stanza, but it's still a ballad stanza of sorts, a modified ballad stanza. It's faithful to the precedent, as it were, of the Hymn of Juan Diego. When it came to writing about Father Marquette, the form was in several senses chosen for me. The classic line of French poetry is what's called the Alexandrine, from a medieval romance about Alexander the Great. And it's simply a 12-syllable or 6-footed line, and each line rhymes with the one that follows, so you have a couplet. If you write the line out long, it looks like a long single line, and it is that, it can be that, and it's certainly in the French it is, but in English, we tend to hear hexameter lines with 6 feet. We tend to kind of hear a pause so that it becomes natural to break it in 2. And once you break it in 2, then you have what's called half meter, which is yet another traditional variation on the ballad quatrain. So I knew I was going to write about Father Marquette in the Alexandrine because it was the classic French mode, but I was doubly affirmed in that when I read in Kevin Starr's History of Catholicism in North America, that when a French ship was coming into, I think it was into Quebec City in the early 17th century, the mayor of the town came out in a small boat and greeted this arriving ship with a poem of welcome and prayer that was itself written in the Alexandrine form. So among the first poems ever written on our continent was in fact an Alexandrine poem. It's an excellent form, just like the ballad, for telling stories in. So the Agnus Dei of Jacques Marquette. So this poem comes right at the middle of the River of the Immaculate Conception, and it's timed within the liturgical form of the poem to correspond to the Agnus Dei, because Marquette not only consecrated everything he could to the Immaculate Conception, including the Mississippi River, as this poem will tell you, but he also truly sought to be another Lamb of God. He thought nothing of losing his life to spread the gospel and to spread to the American Indians the word of Jesus Christ and of his Blessed Mother. So here we are, the Agnus Dei of Jacques Marquette. Before the thousands, Père Marquette stood up to preach that through the Blessed Virgin none escape his reach, that though he suffer all, he'd bear the sacred story down the great river he'd entitled to her glory. And now before him knelt the warriors and their chiefs, to whom a year ago he'd promised her reliefs from sin and solitude, from shadowed ignorance, and in that wounded wilderness her peace advance. Behind him, 4 great images of her were raised on Chinese taffeta that left the fires amazed. They heard of Jesus Christ, who on that day had died, for them upon the cross his mother there beside, and John who loved and honored her with filial love. The mysteries of the faith seemed hovering just above. But even as he spoke, and offered all as gift, Marquette felt deep within his side the aching rift that would, a few days hence, force him to leave again this mission he had credited the Virgin's gain. And leaving thus, he knew already, he would meet her robed and crowned with stars, and treading with bare feet. Those feet, he told them now, would trample Satan's head, restoring life and light to this world dark and dead. For years he'd served the mission of the Northern Lake, learned the Algonquin tongues, and said Mass for the sake of those who had been baptized by priests come before him. But it was not for this so many waters bore him to that new world where Jogues and Jean Brebeuf had died. And not for this, that in his private prayers he cried, begging Our Lady send him, where all were deprived of knowledge of her Son. Then Joliet arrived. This day of the Immaculate Conception, he comes, bearing news we are to solve the mystery of the great water our Illini say runs west, beyond those lands claimed by a French or Spanish crest. Marquette wrote, but by then the lakeshore sank in ice. They waited, stomachs hungry, fur coats plagued with lice. He waited, making the nation long retreat, his prayer cold breath, and penance his cold ache of feet. They waited till the sun returned with biting flies. Then 7 men with corn and smoked meats for supplies launched birch canoes at last, that they might go explore what other miracles Our Lady had in store. How beautiful, descending the Muscousin stream, to slip along soft waters marshy with the cream of wild rice. As they passed, the birds rose in a cloud and flapped one great arc through the sky until it bowed back to the water and hid once again in reeds, whose stalks brushed the canoe and filled its floor with seeds. Marquette knew it a place through which a man may pass as unremembered guess as breath upon cold glass, and spoke into that emptiness a further vow, to dedicate to Mary all that she'd allow. As deer roused from their drink upon the iron shore, then fled beneath the towering oaks, he heard the roar, dim at first, loudening as the idle current sped, and spat them forth upon the Mississippi's bed. I felt Marquette would write, a joy I can't express, to name for her that river, which flows like a tress, down the vast back of that great land we bring to Christ and trust the protection of our King. The river was so wide and gentle, deep and brown, they drew their oars in, let its silence take them down. And then a giant fish struck, shaking the canoe, and in the grass a great wild cat came into view, straight-whiskered, tiger-faced, with pelt of gray and black. A bone-nosed surgeon leaped and splashed upon its back. But more than these and stranger, prairies to the west seemed shadowed with dark masses, horned in shaggy vest, broad-headed and thick-maned, hump-shouldered buffalo, whose skin and meat they had already come to know, but whose horns they had yet to see impale a man, then hoof him in the dust within a moment's span. For days I saw such creatures, but no human being. We kept our fire small, for fear of what they'd bring, and bedded through the dark hours in our anchored boats, where I stared up at stars and murmured o'er my notes, knowing that all we carried with us could be lost, and that I'd pay with pleasure a still greater cost, so long as I may bring to such a wild part the mysteries Our Lady pondered in her heart. But then Marquette would write, one afternoon they found faint tracks imprinted in the shoreline's muddy ground. Marquette and Joliet alone pursued the trail, and silent came and seen within a village pale. Then loud they raised their voices, and the priest stood tall, in long black robe, as braves came answering their call. The Indians wore French cloth and bore a calumet, dangled with greeny feathers as they came and met the strangers. They were called the Illinois, one said. An old man spoke, how beautiful the sun that's led you Frenchmen to us, and we welcome you in peace. Then women crowded, children stared up without cease. As all these gathered, the young priest stood forth to speak. O people, you like us the Father made, and weak like us, you are the children of his sacred pity. He wishes you to join him in his holy city. And so he sent me down this river as his priest, that all who live upon it may share in his feast. Let crosses be upraised and idols downward hurled, that all shall see his peace restored into the world. Their chief replied, the sun grows bright, the river smooth, the corn more sweet, tobacco in its power to soothe, because you come among us. But, I beg of you, proceed no farther, for a beast downstream will chew your boats to splinters, and the Arkansas are fierce. Return all greeting with a wail, and gladly pierce the stranger with their arrows and their Spanish guns. There is no further good where this great river runs. But when he paused, the priest replied that he'd no fear to lose that life God gave him, not to be held dear, then promised to those people he would come again, to live with them if that was what the Lord should deign. And though the harsh Missouri caught them in its flood, great demons stalked the cliffs, and Indians cried for blood, though even Marquette would feel an axe blade graze his head, and fear and mosquitoes left him too weak to tread. Within a year, though pale and worn, he did return, and there he preaches till his guts begin to burn, and names one last place after the Immaculate, for even now he knows the hour has grown late. He takes his leave again to trace the northern shore, where in the Easter twilight he can row no more. His two companions urge him on with words and tears, but he has prayed for this and silences their fears. My brother Xavier died in wretchedness afar, and brothers Isaac, Jean, and Gabriel died in war. They lay him by the water, built a hut of bark, and see his eyes are brightening as the sky grows dark. Mother of God, remember me, they hear him call. And then Marquette laid back his head, and that was all.
The last clip I'm going to play for you is one more from my interview with Mark Christopher Brandt, but this one is not about music. Mark, in addition to being a pianist and composer, has also written a couple of wonderful little spiritual books at the request of his spiritual director. They're approved by the church, and one of them is a book of meditations on the rosary, and another is meditations for the Stations of the Cross. They're both available on his website, markchristopherbrandt.com. So here we talk about one of my favorite of his reflections, which is on the Station of the Cross, where Jesus speaks to the weeping women of Jerusalem. Your reflection on the women weeping at Jerusalem, I always find particularly germane to our time, in the time of just sort of outrage and emotional responses to things, where Jesus they're weeping, and it's good that they're sorry that he's suffering, but he's challenging them to look deeper and look at the reality of sin.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much the story of my life as a Catholic. It's not, I just don't think it's productive to point fingers at people as the problem. This is why this is happening. Well, that person is the reason things, if these people are, or the voting situation, if we had these people in power, we would do that. So it's always, a human thing and an emotional thing, but we should be looking at a prayer thing. We should be praying for these situations, because Jesus told those women then, don't be wasting too much energy crying for me, because I'm here to save you and your children, and you're going to miss it. And so is the next generation and the next generations to come for the next 2,000 years. Then here we are looking at this and not seeing what he actually did. And the children of the children of the children are here now in power, doing all kinds of unspeakable things because nobody prayed. And I see these things connected to the prayer life. And I know we have to have action. We have to have people doing things. We have to have people involved to do the good. But if there's no prayer, then none of it matters. And it's the same thing happens that, like we've talked about with music. If you're not praying, you're going to write a great pop song. You're going to inspire a lot of people, but nobody's going to think about going to heaven. You get out there and do a nice political movement. You want to do some activism. It's great. You're going to get hundreds, maybe even thousands of people following for a greater good, but it's not going to last. It's going to implode and be corrupted because it's not built on the Holy Spirit. So if we really want the world to change and be better, we should all be doing what we've been asked to do, and that's convert and pray. And sometimes people say, I've heard them say, well, prayer is good, but you got to act too. And then action is, unfortunately, complaining about the status quo or crying about the injustice or the horror of it. But these things should make you go and pray. It shouldn't make you sit at the dinner table and be pointing at the TV and mad at the idiots. It should make you go home and pray the rosary, pray the chaplet, and do what our Lord and our Blessed Mother has asked, because that is how we're going to change the world, or we're going to watch it fall apart in front of us and all be sad to discover that we could have participated in saving more souls, because it's got to end anyway. It's going to end anyway.
Right.
But we could be saving more souls. That's the essence of that's why the books are out. In my case, was that message that you're the solution to the problem. I'm the solution to the problem. I see the news and I see the problems there. I have the answer to that problem. The answer is Jesus. And I go to him and I pray about that situation. And then I wait to see what he's going to do. That's how I've tried to live my life. It's guaranteed results because you go to God and not to the
Right.
the railing against injustice that we all can get caught up in. It's the no hypocrisy code that I've always tried to live by since I converted. It's easy to say why everything's bad, but if you walk by the mirror of truth, is with regard to your soul, you're part of the problem every time. There's something we're all doing not enough, or we could be doing more, or we're making excuses somewhere. And why wait till we meet Jesus face to face in death and have to get all that worked out? Let's work that out now, and we could see this world change very rapidly. You could get up there and talk political things all day long and get everyone spun up. But I guarantee you, if more people just picked up their rosary and started praying and working on themselves, God would change all of these situations rapidly. And that's what we're missing. It's very simple. It's not complicated at all.